Night in the year 1400 was not an absence of light but a different kind of world. If you opened your eyes in the darkness, there would be no soft electric glow, no distant hum of engines, no faint shimmer from a window across the street. Instead, there would be layers of shadow, the faint red breath of embers, and the quiet architecture of timber and stone holding the cold at bay. You would not wake with sudden alarm. Sleep in this age often unfolded in segments. The first rest would begin soon after dusk, when the last streaks of violet faded from the sky. Hours later, without urgency, you might stir. Your body would rise from warmth into a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though the night itself had paused to make room for thought. The air inside your home would carry the scent of ash, wool, and packed earth. If you lived in a small English village, your dwelling would likely be a timber-framed structure with wattle and daub walls. The floor beneath you might be hard earth, scattered with rushes that had absorbed the memory of countless days. Above, heavy beams would form dark lines against a ceiling that vanished into shadow. You would lie beneath coarse linen, perhaps sharing the bed with family members. Privacy was rare. Space was precious. The mattress might be stuffed with straw or feathers if fortune allowed. As your breathing slowed into awareness, you would sense the gentle rise and fall of others beside you. The fire would be the only witness to your waking. In many homes, the hearth never fully died. Banked carefully before sleep, its embers would glow beneath a thin crust of gray ash. A faint pulse of red would flicker when stirred by a wandering current of air. That dim light would shape the room in fragile outlines, the edge of a wooden chest, the hanging curve of a kettle, the silhouette of tools resting by the wall. Outside, the village would be held in near total darkness. There were no street lamps lining the paths. No glass panes reflecting moonlight from neighboring houses. Windows were small, often shuttered, and sometimes covered with oiled cloth rather than clear glass. If the moon was full and the sky free of cloud, its pale illumination might seep through cracks and settle across the floor like a thin sheet of silver. But on a moonless night, the world beyond the door would dissolve into ink. You might remain lying still, listening. The sounds of 1400 at night were subtle yet distinct. Wind slipping between thatch. The creak of wood adjusting to the cool. A distant dog stirring in its sleep. The occasional low murmur of cattle sheltered in a nearby byre. If you lived near woodland, the faint call of an owl would drift across the fields, measured and unhurried. There was no mechanical rhythm to accompany the dark hours. No ticking clock marking time. Time was felt rather than counted. If the cold pressed too sharply against your skin, you might rise. The floor would chill your bare feet instantly. Reaching for a small iron poker, you would kneel at the hearth and gently disturb the ashes. A scatter of sparks would flare. With practiced care, you might add a thin twig or two, coaxing flame without wasting precious fuel. Firewood was labor, and labor was survival. As the embers brightened, the room would breathe again. In this quiet interval between sleeps, many people prayed. The church shaped the rhythm of life, and night offered solitude rarely found during daylight hours. You might fold your hands, whispering familiar words into the stillness. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for your own heart to hear. If you were literate, a rare privilege, you might keep a small devotional text near your bed. The pages would be thick, the script dark and deliberate. Reading by firelight required patience. Letters shifted and blurred in the flicker, and wax from a small tallow candle might drip onto the margins if you were not careful. Candles were costly, each inch burned carried value. More often, you would simply think. The first sleep carried the body into rest, this waking interval belonged to reflection. You might consider the coming harvest if it was late summer, or the condition of stored grain if winter pressed close. You might measure the health of a child by the steadiness of their breathing beside you. You might trace, in memory, the face of someone buried in the churchyard beyond the fields. The church itself would stand silent now, its stone walls absorbing darkness. No bell would ring until morning prayers. Yet its presence would be felt, even unseen. In 1400, faith was not a private matter tucked into quiet corners of thought. It shaped the sky, the soil, the fate of kings, the meaning of illness, the turning of seasons. If clouds parted and the moon shone brightly, you might step outside. Opening the wooden door would release a faint groan from its hinges. The night air would meet you with clarity. Without smoke trapped beneath rafters, without the warmth of bodies, the world would feel sharper. Stars would appear in astonishing number. Far from modern cities, the sky in 1400 was crowded with light. Constellations would arc overhead, steady and ancient. You might not know their astronomical names, yet you would know their patterns. They guided travelers. They marked seasons. They whispered continuity. The path through the village would be uneven, familiar beneath your feet. Houses would crouch low and dark. Livestock would shift in enclosed yards. The scent of damp soil would rise from fields resting under frost or dew. If you listened carefully, you might hear the distant rush of a stream turning a mill wheel somewhere beyond sight. Night carried risk, but not constant terror. People respected its boundaries. Few wandered without reason. Thieves preferred shadow, yet communities were tightly bound. Suspicion fell quickly on strangers. Doors were barred not from constant fear, but from prudence learned over generations. If you were a watchman in a larger town, your waking would be duty rather than choice. Town walls enclosed narrow streets, and the gates were secured after dusk. Patrols moved slowly, carrying lanterns shielded by horn panes. The glow would be soft and amber, revealing cobblestones slick with moisture. Footsteps would echo against stone facades. A watchman's task was vigilance against fire as much as crime. In crowded towns, flames spread swiftly. A forgotten candle, a tipped brazier, a spark caught in dry thatch, any could consume an entire district before dawn. Listening for unusual crackling or smelling smoke sharper than hearth fire was essential. But if you were not bound to such responsibility, your time remained your own. You might sit on a low stool near the hearth and mend a garment. Even in dim light, hands accustomed to thread could work slowly. Cloth was valuable. Wool spun over months could not be wasted. Each patch carried quiet testimony to care. Or you might simply return to bed. Second sleep would come gently. There was no alarm waiting to drag you back to consciousness. Dawn would seep gradually into the world. Roosters would stir first, their calls breaking across fields. Pale blue would replace black at the edge of the sky. Frost might glitter on thatched roofs, catching early light. But that was hours away. For now, the night in 1400 would continue its patient unfolding. In monasteries, similar intervals of wakefulness structured the hours. Monks rose in darkness for prayer, their chants filling stone corridors with low resonance. Oil lamps cast trembling halos along cloister walls. Sandals brushed against flagstones worn smooth by centuries of passage. Their wakefulness was disciplined, ordered by rule rather than instinct. In castles, too, the night carried distinct rhythms. A lord might sleep behind thick stone walls, attended by guards who remained alert through rotating watches. Torches in iron brackets would burn steadily, their smoke rising toward vaulted ceilings. Armor might rest on stands nearby, polished yet scarred from use. The weight of political tension lingered even during rest. Yet whether peasant, monk, artisan, or noble, the experience of waking at night shared a common quality: stillness unbroken by constant stimulation. Darkness was not an inconvenience to be conquered. It was an environment to inhabit. If rain began to fall, its sound upon thatch would be immediate and encompassing. Each drop would register. Without the insulation of modern materials, weather announced itself intimately. A sudden gust might send a fine spray through gaps near the roofline. You would adjust blankets, shift position, and wait. You would know that most of the world slept as you did, bound by the same cycle of sun and season. News traveled slowly. Events beyond a day's walk remained distant rumors. The night narrowed attention to what was near and tangible: breath, fire, wind, memory. Eventually, drowsiness would reclaim you. Your body, attuned to patterns older than clocks, would settle once more into warmth. The embers would fade again toward gray. Outside, the stars would continue their measured arc somewhere beyond the horizon. Morning would begin its slow approach. And when it arrived, it would not arrive suddenly. Light would not burst across the horizon in an instant. It would seep upward, thin and pale, touching the highest branches first, then sliding slowly down the trunks of trees, across hedges, and along the ridges of distant hills. If you had returned to sleep, you would feel its presence before fully waking. A subtle shift in the air. A change in the tone of silence. The second sleep ended not with urgency but with obligation. If you lived in a farming household, morning tasks waited without announcement. Animals required tending before any thought of breakfast. A cow heavy with milk would not tolerate delay. Chickens stirred as soon as faint light brushed the yard. Their restless scratching formed a quiet percussion beneath the waking sky. You would rise again from the bed you had left only hours before. The straw mattress would rustle softly. Blankets would be folded with care, preserving warmth for the coming night. There was no excess linen, no surplus of comfort. Every item possessed weight and value. Stepping outdoors, you would notice how the world smelled different at dawn. Moist soil carried a freshness that did not exist at noon. Wood smoke from neighboring homes drifted low, bluish and steady. Breath clouded briefly in cool seasons, then vanished. In 1400, the calendar shaped labor. The agricultural year governed nearly everything. If it were early spring, the fields would be marked with furrows cut by plow and oxen. Seeds would lie hidden beneath damp earth, awaiting warmth. If it were late summer, grain would stand tall and pale, awaiting harvest under a sun that climbed with measured confidence. Yet your memory of waking in darkness would remain distinct from daylight responsibilities. Night and day were not merely different in brightness, they belonged to separate realms of experience. In towns, sunrise revealed narrow streets built of timber and stone, overhanging upper stories nearly touching above the road. Waste from households might be carried away, yet remnants lingered in corners. The scent of tannery vats, fish stalls, and fresh bread would mix into a layered atmosphere that spoke of trade and survival. Guilds governed much of urban life. If you were an apprentice to a cooper, you would enter a workshop filled with the scent of oak and iron hoops. Tools hung in careful arrangement along walls darkened by years of use. Shavings would gather beneath benches. The rhythm of mallet against stave would begin soon after light settled fully into the street. But the night still shaped these towns. Curfews were common. City gates closed at dusk, and those who arrived late might find themselves sleeping outside the walls until morning. Travel after dark was discouraged, not solely because of bandits, but because roads were uneven and landmarks vanished once sunlight withdrew. A cart could overturn easily. A horse might stumble into a ditch invisible in shadow. If you had awakened during the dark hours and chosen to remain outside, perhaps walking beyond the village boundary, you would have sensed how profoundly different the countryside felt before dawn. Fields lay quiet beneath a faint mist. Dew clung to grasses, bending them slightly under its delicate weight. Streams ran without interruption, their surfaces reflecting fragments of fading starlight. You might have encountered a shepherd rising early, guiding sheep toward grazing land. Cloaks wrapped tightly against chill, staffs planted firmly into earth, these figures moved with patient economy. Their lives were defined less by clock than by season and weather. The year 1400 sat near the close of what later generations would call the Middle Ages. In some regions, memory of plague still lingered in communal consciousness. Half a century earlier, the Black Death had thinned populations dramatically. Entire households vanished within weeks. Churchyards expanded. Fields lay untended in its aftermath. By your waking in this era, recovery had begun, yet scars remained. Abandoned cottages might still stand at the edge of settlements, their thatch sagging inward. Stories of illness were not told with theatrical horror, but with sober acknowledgement. Night could sometimes stir recollection of those losses, especially when silence settled deeply. In Italy, cities such as Florence and Venice were already stirring toward artistic and commercial expansion. Merchants tracked shipments across the Mediterranean. Cloth dyed in brilliant hues moved along trade routes. Banking families calculated risk by candlelight in upper chambers overlooking canals or piazzas. If you had woken at night in such a city, the darkness would not have been absolute. Reflections from water might have carried faint glimmers. Lanterns swung gently from iron brackets near bridges. The quiet splash of an oar could break the stillness as a boatman guided his craft along a narrow canal. Further north, in regions under the authority of Charles VI, political instability shaped daily life. News of conflicts between factions drifted through markets and taverns. Even so, most nights in rural France remained unremarkable. Farmers slept as they always had, beneath beams darkened by smoke and time. If you were a traveler staying at an inn, waking at night would bring a different sensation. Inns varied widely in quality. Some were little more than large common rooms with straw pallets arranged side by side. Others offered modest chambers separated by thin partitions. Candles might burn low in sconces near the hearth. The smell of ale, damp wool, and horse sweat from stables below would mingle. Travel was slow and deliberate. Roads followed ancient Roman routes in some regions, their stones worn smooth by centuries of passage. Elsewhere, they were little more than rutted tracks. Merchants carried goods by packhorse or cart. Pilgrims walked toward shrines such as Canterbury Cathedral or Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, guided by faith and endurance. If you were among them, your waking at night might be prompted by unfamiliar surroundings. The breathing of strangers nearby. The creak of a signboard outside shifting in wind. You might reach instinctively for a pouch containing coins or small valuables, reassured by its presence before drifting again toward rest. In regions of the Holy Roman Empire, towns clustered along rivers such as the Rhine. Vineyards traced gentle slopes. Castles crowned hilltops, their towers visible for miles during daylight. At night, these fortifications appeared as darker shapes against a slightly lighter sky. Within castle walls, routines persisted through darkness. Kitchens banked their fires. Guards rotated along parapets. Storage rooms held salted meats, dried legumes, and barrels of ale. Stone corridors retained cold long after sunset, and tapestries hung to soften drafts. If you were of noble rank, waking at night might carry concerns different from those of a peasant. Alliances shifted. Letters arrived sealed with wax bearing unfamiliar crests. The safety of heirs weighed heavily. Even within thick walls, vulnerability lingered in thought. Beyond Europe, the world in 1400 was equally alive beneath the stars. In the cities of the Ottoman realm, mosques rose with slender minarets reaching into the sky. Courtyards lay open to moonlight. Merchants in bazaars secured their goods at dusk, covering textiles and spices beneath protective cloth. Night prayers echoed softly through stone arcades. Further east, in the great cities of the Ming dynasty, lanterns sometimes illuminated streets long after sunset. Urban centers such as Nanjing held populations that dwarfed many European towns. Watchmen patrolled wide avenues. Markets specialized in silk, porcelain, and lacquerware. The discipline of imperial administration extended even into nocturnal order. If you had awakened in such a place, the darkness would feel structured rather than empty. Curfews existed, yet activity did not cease entirely. The faint glow of paper lanterns might reveal painted beams and tiled roofs rising in elegant symmetry. Across the Sahara, caravans moved between oases guided by stars. Night travel offered relief from daytime heat. Camels padded steadily across sand that shimmered under moonlight. Traders carried salt, gold, and stories linking distant regions into fragile networks of exchange. Waking in a desert encampment would mean lifting your head beneath a canopy of brilliant constellations. The air would be dry, the silence expansive. A small fire might burn low within a ring of stones. Tents woven from coarse fabric would ripple gently with wind. In the Andean highlands, communities aligned with the legacy of the Inca observed celestial movements carefully. Terraces climbed steep mountainsides. Llamas rested near stone enclosures. The night sky, unclouded and immense, framed peaks that seemed to merge with darkness itself. Everywhere in 1400, waking at night carried intimacy with the natural world. Artificial illumination was limited, fragile, and costly. Fire required tending. Oil demanded resources. Darkness, therefore, was not banished but accepted. If illness stirred you from sleep, remedies were drawn from herb gardens or local knowledge. A bundle of dried chamomile might steep in heated water. A poultice of crushed leaves could be applied to aching joints. Physicians existed in cities, trained in universities that preserved classical texts, yet for many, healing remained domestic and communal. You might rise quietly to check on a child feverish with heat. A damp cloth pressed gently to the brow. A whispered prayer offered not as performance but as habit shaped by generations. In monasteries, manuscripts were copied by hand. Even during daylight, the labor required intense focus. At night, scriptoria were usually dark, yet on occasion a determined monk might continue by lamp, shielding flame carefully to avoid damage to parchment. Ink prepared from oak galls and soot would dry slowly under wavering light. If you were such a monk waking before matins, you would wrap a woolen cloak around your shoulders and step into a corridor echoing faintly. The rhythm of communal life regulated even the hours of darkness. Bells marked divisions of prayer, though not every community followed identical schedules. Far to the north, in Scandinavian settlements, winter nights extended for many hours. Snow absorbed sound, creating an almost complete hush. Houses constructed of timber and turf retained warmth efficiently. Oil lamps fueled by animal fat cast steady light across carved wooden interiors. In these regions, stories often filled the long dark intervals between sleeps. Though not delivered in theatrical fashion, tales of ancestors, voyages, and landscapes passed quietly from one generation to the next. Memory was a living archive, sustained orally. If you woke there, you might lie listening to wind move across frozen ground. The sensation would not necessarily be one of fear, but of scale. The world beyond your walls felt vast and indifferent. Everywhere, the absence of constant noise allowed inner life to expand. Thoughts traveled without interruption. Plans formed slowly. Regrets surfaced gently and receded. Eventually, the responsibilities of daylight would claim attention fully. Yet the experience of waking at night in 1400 would remain distinct from anything shaped by modern illumination. It was a space between obligations, between conscious effort and complete rest. The second sleep might end with a rooster's call or the faint tolling of a distant bell. You would rise again into labor, into conversation, into the visible realm. But the memory of darkness, its depth, its clarity, its patience, would linger quietly within you as the sun climbed higher and shadows shortened across the land. As the sun climbed and morning settled into its full clarity, the memory of night receded but did not disappear. It remained like a thin layer beneath the surface of awareness, shaping the way daylight felt. In 1400, the boundary between dark and light was not a sharp division but a gradual exchange. If you lived near the sea, waking at night carried a different character altogether. Coastal air was thick with salt, and even in sleep you might sense the distant pulse of waves. Fishing communities rose before dawn as a matter of necessity. Boats were pushed from shore while stars still lingered, sails catching the faintest early breeze. Should you awaken during those hours in a harbor town along the Atlantic coast, perhaps near Lisbon, you would hear ropes creaking against wooden masts and the hollow knock of hull against pier. The smell of tar and brine would drift through narrow lanes. Lanterns, shielded against wind, swung gently from posts near the docks, casting elongated reflections across black water. Men preparing nets worked in near silence. Their hands moved with inherited skill, checking knots and smoothing tangled lines. The sea offered sustenance but demanded respect. Night voyages were not uncommon, yet they were measured and deliberate. Without modern navigation instruments, sailors relied on stars, coastline familiarity, and long practice. Further inland, rivers functioned as arteries of commerce. Barges laden with grain or timber moved slowly along currents shaped by centuries of flow. If you had awakened beside such a river, perhaps along the Thames near London, you might detect the steady rhythm of water striking wooden embankments. Bridges spanned the width with arches that appeared almost spectral before dawn. London in 1400 was already substantial in size, though nothing like its later vastness. Timber houses leaned toward each other above narrow streets. St. Paul's Cathedral, in its medieval form, dominated the skyline. At night, its great silhouette blended into darkness, a presence sensed more than seen. Within its precincts, clerics maintained routines that transcended ordinary hours. Candles flickered in side chapels. Stone floors retained cold even in summer. If you had stirred from sleep in a chamber nearby, the faint echo of chanting might have reached your ears, drifting through corridors built generations earlier. Elsewhere in England, in market towns scattered across rolling countryside, weekly fairs shaped economic life. Goods from surrounding villages converged in central squares. Cloth, cheese, salted fish, iron tools, each found place upon wooden stalls. Though these gatherings occurred during daylight, preparation often began in darkness. Traders arrived early to secure favorable positions. If you woke in such a town during the night preceding a fair, you might sense anticipation in subtle ways. Wagons positioned near gates. Livestock tethered quietly along outer fields. The air carrying faint scents of unfamiliar produce. In the Iberian Peninsula, territories were divided between Christian kingdoms and the Emirate of Granada. Cultural exchange, tension, and coexistence shaped daily existence. Cities such as Granada were illuminated at night by oil lamps placed within courtyards and along palace walls. The Alhambra stood upon its hill, intricate and serene beneath moonlight. Should you awaken within such a palace complex, carved stucco walls would reflect delicate patterns in faint light. Water channels murmured softly through gardens. Cypress trees rose dark against the sky. The architecture itself invited contemplation, its geometry guiding the eye along arches and mosaics. In agricultural estates surrounding these cities, irrigation systems carried water through carefully measured channels. Farmers relied upon seasonal rains, yet also upon engineered distribution that sustained orchards and fields. Night inspection of such systems was sometimes necessary during dry months. A blocked channel could mean loss of crops. If you rose to check such a passage under moonlight, you would carry a small lamp shielded against wind. Its glow would reveal the steady glide of water over stone. The scent of citrus blossoms might linger in air, even after darkness deepened. Further east, in the lands influenced by the Byzantine tradition, monasteries clung to cliffs and hillsides. One such example, Mount Athos, housed communities devoted to prayer and contemplation. There, the hours of night were structured carefully. Bells marked intervals not solely for sleep but for worship. If you woke within those walls, you would wrap yourself in a simple robe and step into a chapel lit by oil lamps suspended from chains. Incense would hang lightly in the air. Frescoes painted generations earlier would emerge from shadow, their colors muted yet enduring. In the vast steppes stretching across Central Asia, nomadic groups moved with herds across open grassland. Their dwellings, portable and circular, were constructed of felt and wood lattice. The night sky in such regions appeared immense, undisturbed by artificial brightness. Constellations seemed close enough to trace with a fingertip. Waking within a yurt during the dark hours would bring awareness of wind sweeping unobstructed across land. The felt walls would rustle softly. Embers in a central hearth would cast a subdued glow upward through a roof opening. Horses tethered nearby might shift occasionally, their movement gentle and unhurried. Trade routes linked these territories to distant cities. Caravans carried silk, spices, and metalwork across thousands of miles. Night encampments were arranged carefully for protection. Fires were positioned strategically. Guards maintained watch not in constant fear but in steady attentiveness shaped by experience. In West Africa, along the Niger River, cities such as Timbuktu functioned as centers of scholarship and trade. Manuscripts written in Arabic script filled libraries supported by learned families. Mosques constructed of mud brick rose above streets shaped by centuries of movement. If you had awakened there, the warmth of the day would linger long after sunset. Courtyards offered space for cooling air to circulate. The desert sky, clear and expansive, revealed stars in striking clarity. Scholars might rise before dawn to read or reflect, tracing lines of script illuminated by small lamps. In northern Europe, dense forests covered vast areas. Timber was abundant, yet travel through such regions after dark required caution. Wolves roamed, though they seldom approached settled communities without reason. The forest possessed its own rhythm, branches shifting, leaves stirring, occasional movement of unseen creatures. If your dwelling stood at the edge of such woodland, waking at night would bring layered sounds. The snap of a twig under animal foot. The distant hoot of an owl. Wind passing through pine needles in a continuous whisper. Winter altered everything. During colder months, nights lengthened considerably. Darkness arrived early and remained. In Scandinavian and Baltic regions, snow reflected moonlight, creating a faint luminous quality even when skies were overcast. Ice formed along riverbanks, transforming water into solid pathways. Waking during a winter night required particular resolve. Rising from warmth into frigid air demanded effort. Firewood consumption increased significantly. Households calculated supplies carefully, aware that shortages could prove dangerous. In alpine villages near peaks that would later be crossed by explorers and merchants with greater frequency, homes were constructed to withstand heavy snowfall. Roofs sloped steeply to prevent accumulation. Livestock might be sheltered within lower levels of dwellings, their body heat contributing to interior warmth. If you opened your eyes there at midnight, you would see frost tracing delicate patterns along interior beams. The silence outside would be profound, muffled by layers of snow. Even small movements would seem amplified within enclosed space. Elsewhere, in the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, cities such as Ayutthaya flourished with vibrant trade networks. Temples adorned with intricate carvings rose above waterways that functioned as thoroughfares. Boats moved steadily even after sunset, guided by lantern light reflected across rippling surfaces. Waking beside such canals would bring the gentle lap of water against wooden stilts. The scent of tropical vegetation would permeate the air. Insects might hum softly beyond walls woven from bamboo. Across these varied landscapes, one constant remained: night imposed limits and invited reflection. Artificial light sources were fragile and finite. Tallow candles burned quickly and emitted thick smoke. Beeswax candles offered cleaner light but were expensive. Oil lamps required steady supply. Torches produced more illumination yet were impractical indoors for extended use. Because of these constraints, much of the world's activity aligned closely with the sun. Even those accustomed to segmented sleep treated wakeful intervals as quiet interludes rather than opportunities for extended labor. If you were a craftsman producing illuminated manuscripts in a scriptorium, you would likely reserve delicate work for daylight. Gold leaf required steady hands and clear visibility. Pigments ground from minerals and plants revealed their true colors only under natural light. If you were a blacksmith, your forge might glow brightly even at night, yet prolonged labor after sunset consumed fuel rapidly. Most production ceased once darkness settled fully, unless urgent necessity demanded otherwise. In households of modest means, evening meals were simple. Pottage simmered slowly over fire. Bread baked earlier in communal ovens was shared. Ale provided nourishment and hydration, safer often than untreated water. After such meals, conversation might unfold briefly before fatigue claimed attention. Without entertainment devices, stories were shaped by memory and repetition. Songs carried familiar melodies. The day's labor left bodies ready for rest. Thus, when you woke in 1400 during the middle hours of night, you did so within a world that accepted darkness as part of its design. There was no expectation that the dark should be conquered or transformed into artificial noon. It was a phase in a larger cycle, one that allowed space for thought, prayer, quiet maintenance, and the slow turning of seasons. As the centuries would unfold, this relationship with night would change profoundly. But in 1400, if you found yourself awake while others slept, you were not alone in the experience. Across continents and climates, countless others lay beneath the same canopy of stars, breathing softly, listening to wind and water, and waiting patiently for the return of light. Beyond the fields, forests, and harbors already stirring under faint light, there existed another realm shaped by stone, scholarship, and the slow turning of political ambition. If you had awakened in 1400 within the walls of a university town, the night would carry an intellectual stillness distinct from rural quiet. In places such as Paris, students gathered from distant regions to study theology, law, and medicine. The Latin Quarter hummed with debate during daylight hours, yet after sunset, its narrow lanes grew subdued. Timber-framed houses leaned inward, their upper stories nearly touching. Lanterns flickered outside certain inns, casting a trembling halo upon damp cobblestones. If your lodging was a modest chamber rented above a bookseller's stall, you might wake beneath a thin wool blanket, aware of the faint rustle of parchment stacked nearby. Manuscripts were precious. Each page represented hours of careful copying. Margins bore glosses added by generations of readers, layers of interpretation accumulating like sediment. A student's life was not insulated from the realities of the age. Food could be scarce. Heating inconsistent. Academic disputes occasionally spilled into physical altercation in taverns. Yet the night, when it arrived, encouraged quiet study or contemplation. You might light a small candle, shielding its flame with cupped hand to prevent sudden drafts from extinguishing it. The text before you could be a commentary on Aristotle or a theological treatise shaped by centuries of debate. Letters formed in dark ink would seem to hover against the pale surface, wavering slightly as the flame shifted. Outside, watchmen moved through streets with deliberate pace. Their calls marked the hour, though no mechanical clock governed the precise division. Bells from nearby churches sometimes tolled in sequence, each parish maintaining its own rhythm. Further south, in the Iberian kingdoms, royal courts operated within elaborate ceremonial frameworks. If you had awakened inside a palace in Castile or Aragon, the chamber around you would be adorned with tapestries depicting hunts, battles, or biblical scenes. These woven images softened stone walls and served as both insulation and display of wealth. The presence of attendants remained constant even at night. Guards stood beyond heavy doors. Servants slept in adjacent rooms, prepared to respond if summoned. The quiet of such spaces differed from that of a peasant cottage, it carried layers of protocol and hierarchy. Political alliances were negotiated through marriage, correspondence, and careful strategy. Messengers traveled between courts bearing sealed letters impressed with wax insignia. Some journeys required travel through uncertain territories, where local lords asserted authority with varying degrees of fairness. If you woke with thoughts of governance, you might consider the stability of borderlands, the loyalty of vassals, or the fluctuating cost of maintaining armies. Warfare was not constant everywhere, yet preparation for conflict was rarely absent. Across the Alps, in the Italian peninsula, city-states balanced commerce and rivalry. Florence, already known for banking families and textile production, was guided by councils whose decisions shaped trade networks stretching into northern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. If you had awakened in a Florentine household of modest prosperity, you might hear the faint drip of water in a courtyard fountain. Domestic shrines adorned with small painted panels rested against interior walls. The scent of olive oil and stored grain lingered within kitchens where clay jars lined shelves. Artisans labored intensely during daylight, yet at night their workshops rested. Looms stood silent. Pigment jars were sealed. Marble blocks awaited chisel and mallet. Creativity was tied to patronage, and patronage required negotiation. Even as sleep claimed the city, thoughts of commission and reputation occupied minds. In the eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine capital of Constantinople still stood formidable, though political pressures encircled it. Massive walls guarded the city, their outlines stark against moonlit skies. Within, churches crowned with domes reflected faint glimmers from oil lamps. If you had stirred within such walls, perhaps near the Hagia Sophia, the air would carry the mingled scent of incense and sea. The Bosporus flowed steadily, connecting continents and facilitating exchange. Ships anchored in its harbor creaked softly, masts swaying in rhythmic patterns. Further east still, in the Persian city of Isfahan, scholars and merchants interacted beneath tiled domes and vaulted bazaars. Courtyards enclosed by high walls provided privacy and respite from sun. At night, these spaces cooled gradually, their stone surfaces releasing stored warmth. If you awakened there, you might see the faint outline of geometric patterns carved into plaster. Water channels within courtyards reflected fragments of starlight. The call to prayer before dawn would eventually rise from minarets, measured and resonant, marking transition from darkness to activity. In the Indian subcontinent, kingdoms such as the Delhi Sultanate governed expansive territories. Urban centers bustled with trade in spices, textiles, and precious stones. Caravanserais provided lodging for merchants traveling long distances. Waking in such a place would mean sensing the layered presence of diverse cultures. Languages mingled in markets. Architectural forms blended Persian, Turkic, and local traditions. Night did not erase this diversity, it softened its edges. Within domestic spaces, lamps fueled by sesame oil illuminated carved wooden screens. The fragrance of cardamom or cumin might linger from evening meals. In the distance, elephants housed within royal compounds shifted in their enclosures, their movements deep and deliberate. Across the seas, in Japan during the Muromachi period, the capital of Kyoto held temples, palaces, and residential quarters arranged with careful symmetry. Wooden structures with sliding screens allowed flexible division of space. Gardens were designed to be viewed from specific angles, their arrangement encouraging contemplation. If you woke in such a residence, moonlight filtering through paper screens would cast gentle patterns across tatami mats. A small charcoal brazier might glow faintly. Silence would feel cultivated rather than accidental, an extension of aesthetic philosophy valuing simplicity and restraint. Zen monasteries emphasized meditation during early hours. Practitioners rose before dawn to sit in stillness, focusing attention inward. The night thus served as a threshold between physical rest and disciplined awareness. In Mesoamerica, the remnants of earlier civilizations shaped landscapes inhabited by new communities. Cities constructed by ancestors stood partially reclaimed by vegetation. If you awoke within a settlement influenced by Aztec culture, the night sky would stretch above stepped temples rising in silhouette. Ceremonial spaces held significance beyond their physical form. Priests observed celestial cycles with precision, aligning rituals with planetary movements. Darkness was not merely absence, it was canvas for cosmic observation. If you rose quietly and stepped onto a flat rooftop, you might trace the arc of Venus or note the position of familiar constellations. Knowledge of the heavens guided agriculture and religious practice alike. Back in Europe, in regions bordering the Baltic Sea, members of the Hanseatic League coordinated trade across maritime routes. Cities such as Lübeck and Riga prospered through exchange of timber, furs, and grain. Warehouses lined docks, their gabled facades facing water. At night, these buildings stood silent, yet the scent of stored goods permeated surrounding air. Merchants calculated profits by candlelight within upper rooms, their ledgers filled with careful entries. If you had awakened there, you might hear the faint knock of loose shutters and wind from the sea. The brackish scent of harbor water would drift upward. Somewhere nearby, a guard's boots would scrape against wooden planks as he completed his round. Across all these environments, the experience of night varied in texture yet shared certain constraints. Illumination was limited. Movement cautious. Sound carried farther than during day. Time itself felt expansive. Without precise clocks governing each hour, individuals relied on natural cues. The position of the moon. The pattern of stars. The gradual cooling of air. Even the quality of silence shifted subtly as dawn approached. In 1400, mechanical clocks existed in some cities, mounted upon towers and striking bells at intervals. Yet their accuracy varied, and not all communities possessed them. For many, time remained relational rather than numeric. If you were a midwife summoned during dark hours, your waking would be purposeful. You would gather simple instruments, perhaps a small knife sterilized in flame, linen cloths prepared earlier. Moving through quiet streets or along rural paths, you would trust familiarity more than sight. Childbirth did not wait for sunrise. Families relied upon experienced hands shaped by repetition and resilience. The cries of an infant breaking night silence would mark a moment of profound transition, a reminder that even within darkness, beginnings occurred. Similarly, death sometimes arrived before dawn. A fever worsening through evening could culminate in stillness by midnight. Neighbors might gather quietly, offering comfort not through elaborate display but through presence. The night in 1400 held both ordinary continuity and pivotal change. If you were a soldier stationed at a frontier fortification, your wakefulness would align with assigned watch. Cloaked against chill, you would pace along battlements, scanning horizons faintly outlined by starlight. Torches set at intervals would mark sections of wall, their smoke drifting upward. Conflict might be distant rumor or immediate threat. In some regions, borderlands experienced frequent skirmishes. In others, decades passed without major upheaval. Yet vigilance remained woven into the fabric of military life. Should you grow weary during your watch, you would lean briefly against cold stone, listening to wind move across open land. The sensation of smallness beneath vast sky would be unavoidable. And when dawn finally approached, softly, without spectacle, it would gather each of these scattered experiences into a shared transformation. Across continents, cities and villages, palaces and cottages, monasteries and markets, night would yield once more to light. But before that exchange was complete, there would remain a final hour, neither fully dark nor fully bright, when the world seemed suspended between states. If you found yourself awake in that liminal space in the year 1400, you would feel the gentle tension of transition. The hush before birdsong. The faint paling of eastern sky. The awareness that another day, shaped by labor, faith, trade, and uncertainty, was preparing to begin. And you would stand, perhaps at a doorway or window, witnessing that slow and patient return. The first light would touch rooftops unevenly, sliding across ridges of tile and thatch before settling into courtyards and alleys. In 1400, dawn was not merely a visual event but a practical summons. Tasks postponed by darkness pressed forward with renewed urgency. If you stood at the edge of a vineyard in the Rhine Valley near Strasbourg, morning would reveal rows of vines stretching across gentle slopes. Mist might hover low between trellises, diffusing early sunlight into pale gold. Vineyard workers began their routines with measured pace, inspecting leaves for signs of blight or insect damage. Harvest times demanded intense coordination, yet even outside that season, care was constant. Wine was not only a pleasure but a commodity of trade and sustenance. Barrels were crafted by coopers whose workshops carried the scent of fresh-cut oak. If you had awakened during night hours in such a town and now observed daybreak, you would notice how swiftly stillness gave way to purposeful movement. To the north, in the Low Countries, marshlands had been reclaimed gradually through dikes and wind-powered pumps. Though large-scale windmills would flourish more prominently in later centuries, smaller structures already dotted the landscape. In villages near Bruges, canals threaded between brick houses, reflecting pale sky. Morning light revealed the careful geometry of these waterways. Barges loaded with cloth and grain navigated narrow channels, guided by poles and quiet expertise. Markets specialized in textiles, and Flemish weavers were known for intricate patterns woven from fine wool. If you had awakened earlier in one of these homes, you might have heard the faint creak of looms awaiting renewed motion. Further east, within the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, vast forests and open plains shaped livelihoods. In Krakow, Wawel Castle rose above the Vistula River, its towers catching sunrise with subdued brilliance. Artisans and merchants occupied streets radiating from central squares where trade fairs drew participants from across Central Europe. If you observed dawn from such a square, you would see stalls assembled methodically. Spices from distant lands, furs from northern territories, amber polished to warm translucence, each item reflected networks extending far beyond local boundaries. In the Ottoman domains, the city of Bursa served as an early capital before the conquest of Constantinople. Its markets were sheltered by arcades, protecting goods from sun and rain. Silk production flourished, nourished by trade routes linking Asia and Europe. Morning in Bursa carried layered aromas, fresh bread baking in communal ovens, dye vats prepared for textiles, coffee not yet common but herbs steeped for medicinal infusions. If you had awakened during darkness in a merchant's home, you might now step into courtyards alive with preparation. Donkeys laden with goods waited near gates, their harnesses adjusted carefully. Across the Sahara, caravans traversed desert expanses guided by knowledge transmitted through generations. If your awakening had occurred within a tent pitched among dunes, sunrise would arrive with swift brilliance. Sand shifted from cool gray to luminous amber within moments. Caravan leaders studied wind patterns and landmarks such as distinctive rock formations. Camels knelt patiently as loads were secured. Water skins were counted and recounted. Each departure demanded attention to detail, miscalculation could prove costly. Along the Swahili coast of East Africa, towns like Mombasa engaged in maritime commerce linking Africa, Arabia, and India. Coral stone houses lined narrow streets. Wooden doors were carved with geometric and floral motifs, reflecting blended influences. At dawn, fishermen returned with nets glistening from seawater. Markets assembled near mosques whose minarets framed the skyline. If you had awakened during the night in one of these homes, perhaps disturbed by distant surf, you would now witness sails appearing along the horizon, triangular against brightening sky. In the Andean highlands of South America, communities adapted ingeniously to steep terrain. Agricultural terraces carved into mountainsides allowed cultivation of maize and potatoes at varying altitudes. If your night awakening had taken place within a stone dwelling near such terraces, morning would reveal condors gliding silently above valleys. Llamas and alpacas grazed upon sparse vegetation. Their wool provided insulation against cold. Paths connecting settlements wound across ridges, traversed by individuals accustomed to thin air and dramatic elevation changes. In the Chinese Ming dynasty, the capital at Nanjing featured imposing walls and administrative districts organized with precision. Government officials rose early to prepare memorials and petitions addressed to the imperial court. Civil service examinations shaped pathways to advancement, demanding years of disciplined study. If you had awakened in a scholar's residence there, your chamber might contain inkstones, brushes, and scrolls arranged meticulously. Morning light would illuminate calligraphic strokes executed with controlled movement. Paper production, printing blocks, and distribution networks facilitated circulation of ideas at a scale unmatched elsewhere. Agricultural communities surrounding Nanjing cultivated rice in paddies reflecting sky like mirrors. Farmers coordinated irrigation carefully, ensuring consistent water levels. At dawn, reflections of clouds would shimmer across fields, disturbed only by subtle ripples as workers entered barefoot. In the mountainous regions of the Caucasus, fortified villages clung to slopes. Stone towers served both defensive and residential purposes. If your awakening had occurred within such a structure, sunrise would reveal peaks etched sharply against pale sky. Streams descended rapidly through ravines, their sound constant and invigorating. Pastoral life revolved around seasonal migration. Sheep and goats were moved between highland and lowland pastures depending upon climate. Wool and cheese formed staples of subsistence and trade. Meanwhile, in Ireland, monastic ruins stood alongside active parishes. The memory of earlier Viking incursions lingered in coastal settlements. If you had awakened in a thatched cottage along the western shore, you might now see Atlantic waves breaking against cliffs illuminated by cool light. Fields were divided by low stone walls, constructed without mortar yet stable through careful placement. Peat cut from bogs dried in stacks, later serving as fuel during long winters. Morning tasks included tending livestock and preparing simple meals before heading to communal lands. In the Balkans, shifting alliances and conflicts influenced daily life. Fortresses dotted hillsides, their towers visible from afar. If your awakening had taken place within such a region, dawn might reveal banners fluttering faintly atop battlements. Trade caravans continued to pass through despite political uncertainty, linking Adriatic ports with interior territories. Markets offered olive oil, grains, and metal goods shaped by blacksmiths whose anvils would soon ring with renewed activity. Farther west, on the Iberian frontier, the ongoing Reconquista shaped settlement patterns. Fortified towns guarded strategic routes. If you had awakened within one such settlement, morning would expose landscapes marked by alternating stretches of cultivated land and open scrub. Agricultural tools were simple yet effective, wooden plows tipped with iron, sickles honed carefully before harvest. Communal labor reinforced social bonds, as families depended upon one another for planting and gathering. In Iceland, isolated farms endured harsh climates. Turf houses built partially underground provided insulation against relentless wind. If your night awakening occurred within one of these dwellings, dawn would arrive slowly, filtered through thick cloud or emerging suddenly beneath clear sky. Fishing supplemented limited agriculture. Dried cod traveled to European markets, linking even remote settlements to broader economic networks. Sheep provided wool and milk, essential for survival. Across North Africa, in cities like Fez, labyrinthine medinas housed artisans specializing in leatherwork, metal engraving, and ceramics. Tanneries emitted strong odors detectable even at a distance. Dye pits glowed with vivid pigments. If you had awakened before dawn within such a city, perhaps hearing distant footsteps along stone passages, morning would unveil courtyards bustling with activity. Students attended madrasas to study jurisprudence and theology. Merchants arranged goods upon carpets laid carefully across shop thresholds. In the Caribbean, indigenous communities navigated coastal waters using canoes crafted from hollowed tree trunks. Fishing, farming, and inter-island exchange sustained livelihoods. If you had awakened on such an island, the sea's presence would be immediate, horizon unbroken except by occasional distant landforms. As sunlight intensified, shadows shortened. The memory of night receded further, yet its influence persisted in subtle ways. The rhythm of segmented rest shaped energy patterns. Quiet contemplation carried into decisions made during daylight. Across these varied environments, knowledge passed not through printed manuals widely available but through apprenticeship and oral instruction. A young apprentice learned craft by observation and repetition. A farmer inherited understanding of soil from ancestors. A navigator memorized stars through long practice. If you reflected upon your nocturnal awakening while moving through morning tasks, you might sense how darkness had offered perspective. Without constant distraction, awareness sharpened. The crackle of embers, the shift of wind, the arc of constellations, all had formed part of a larger continuity. In 1400, the world was interconnected yet slow-moving. News traveled along trade routes, carried by riders, sailors, and merchants. Rumors preceded confirmation. Letters sealed with wax might take weeks or months to reach destination. Morning assemblies in town squares sometimes included proclamation of royal decrees or announcements regarding taxes and levies. Town criers projected their voices across gathered crowds. Written notices were affixed to doors of churches and guild halls. If you had awakened during night with concern about political changes, daylight might bring partial clarity or deepen uncertainty. Yet daily responsibilities rarely paused for speculation. Crops required tending regardless of shifting alliances. As the sun reached higher arc, markets filled with sound. Haggling over price, clatter of carts, braying of animals, these noises layered upon one another. Yet beneath this activity lingered awareness that evening would return inevitably. Another dusk would gather across vineyards, canals, deserts, terraces, and ports. Another cycle of rest would begin. In certain regions, the turning of seasons altered not only labor but the texture of darkness itself. Autumn nights arrived earlier, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and harvested fields. In Burgundy, near the duchy's administrative center at Dijon, estates expanded under careful stewardship. Vineyards stretched across rolling terrain, and ducal courts cultivated both political influence and artistic patronage. If you had awakened there during a late autumn night, the air within stone chambers would feel noticeably cooler. Tapestries depicting courtly scenes would sway slightly with drafts slipping through narrow arrow slits. Outside, vineyards lay dormant, their branches pruned in preparation for winter. The hush carried anticipation of frost. Within such courts, illuminated manuscripts and early mechanical devices reflected growing curiosity about measurement and order. Astrolabes, carefully crafted from brass, rested on tables beside parchment maps. If wakefulness lingered, you might trace engraved lines by candlelight, contemplating celestial navigation and the geometry of spheres. Further south, in the Kingdom of Naples, coastal settlements thrived beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. If your awakening occurred in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, moonlight would shimmer across water framed by volcanic silhouette. Citrus groves emitted faint fragrance even after sunset. Stone stairways descended toward harbors where fishing boats rocked gently. Maritime life along the Mediterranean demanded awareness of shifting winds. The Mistral and Sirocco shaped travel schedules. Mariners studied clouds at dusk, predicting whether calm seas or sudden squalls would follow. Night thus served as interval for reflection before embarkation at first light. In the Carpathian Mountains, fortified churches stood amid rural communities. Saxon settlers in Transylvania constructed stone walls encircling sacred buildings, creating refuge in times of danger. If you awakened within such a village, the church tower would appear as dark sentinel against starlit sky. Grain stored in fortified granaries represented collective security. Villagers maintained watch rotations during periods of tension, not out of constant alarm but from recognition that stability required vigilance. Across the Atlantic world, long before transoceanic voyages reshaped continents, the Norse settlements in Greenland persisted in isolation. By 1400, their communities faced environmental strain. If your night awakening took place within a turf longhouse there, cold would press heavily against thick earthen walls. Oil lamps fueled by animal fat cast limited illumination. The sea beyond fjords lay encased in drifting ice during certain months. Subsistence relied upon seal hunting and careful management of livestock. The silence of Arctic night could feel immense, broken only by wind sweeping across frozen terrain. Meanwhile, in the Ethiopian highlands, the Solomonic dynasty governed territories marked by dramatic topography. Rock-hewn churches carved into stone centuries earlier remained sites of devotion. If you had awakened near such a sanctuary, perhaps in the region of Lalibela, the landscape at night would appear sculpted from shadow. Stars gleamed sharply in thin mountain air. Pilgrims traveling between sacred sites sometimes continued under moonlight to avoid daytime heat. Faith shaped both movement and rest. In Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire had declined from earlier prominence, yet monumental temples like Angkor Wat still dominated their surroundings. Though political centers shifted, these structures endured. If you woke within nearby settlements, the temple's silhouette would rise against sky, its towers reflecting faint celestial glow. Moats encircling such complexes mirrored stars, creating impression of earth and sky entwined. Stone bas-reliefs depicted mythological scenes whose details emerged differently depending upon angle of light. In Central America, among Maya communities inhabiting Yucatan and highland regions, agriculture remained organized around maize cultivation. Cenotes, natural sinkholes filled with fresh water, served as vital resources. If your awakening occurred near one of these formations, nocturnal humidity would cling to skin. Jungle sounds layered softly, insects, distant rustle of leaves, occasional movement of small animals. Night skies, unobstructed by urban glow, offered expansive canvas for astronomical observation. Calendrical systems guided planting cycles and ceremonial observances. Back in northern Europe, along the Scottish Highlands, clan structures governed social organization. Stone castles perched on rocky outcrops, surrounded by rugged terrain. If you awakened within such a stronghold, the North Sea's distant roar might blend with wind coursing through heather-covered hills. Morning would later reveal mist drifting through glens, yet during night hours, landscape appeared as vast expanse of dark contours. Torches placed along battlements flickered irregularly, their light reflecting on damp stone. In the Baltic interior, Teutonic knights maintained fortified castles constructed from red brick. If your night awakening took place within these imposing complexes, Corridors would echo faintly under footfall of guards completing rounds. Chapels illuminated by candles provided space for private devotion. These military religious orders combined monastic discipline with martial purpose. Their daily routines were structured, yet darkness allowed for moments of solitary thought beyond formal obligation. Further east, within the Golden Horde territories across the Eurasian steppe, remnants of Mongol governance influenced trade and administration. Cities such as Sarai functioned as crossroads connecting diverse cultures. If you awakened within such a settlement, the camp-like arrangement of structures would reflect nomadic heritage blended with urban adaptation. Merchants from distant lands gathered in caravanserais, exchanging goods and information. Night brought relative calm after daytime negotiation. Fires burned low, casting subdued radiance across packed earth courtyards. In Persia's mountainous regions, Kennet systems channeled groundwater across long distances. These underground tunnels required maintenance and expertise. If your awakening occurred near such infrastructure, you might sense faint cool air rising from shafts that punctuated surface landscape. Water's steady presence beneath arid terrain symbolized ingenuity. Even in darkness, its flow continued uninterrupted, sustaining orchards and fields above. Across the Indian Ocean, sailors from Gujarat navigated monsoon patterns with remarkable skill. Ports like Calicut welcomed vessels laden with spices, textiles, and precious stones. If you had awakened in a merchant's residence overlooking harbor, lanterns would sway gently from ship masts anchored offshore. Monsoon winds dictated schedules, creating seasonal rhythms of departure and return. Knowledge of these cycles shaped economic planning and personal anticipation alike. In West Africa's forested regions, communities cultivated yams and palm oil. Drums served as communication tools, transmitting messages across distances through rhythmic patterns. If you woke at night within such a village, drumbeats might occasionally resonate faintly, conveying signals understood by trained listeners. The night thus carried coded language beyond spoken word. In the Iberian Atlantic islands, such as Madeira, sugar cultivation expanded under Portuguese direction. Terraced hillsides were carved to maximize arable land. If your awakening took place in a plantation house, the scent of crushed cane might linger even after darkness deepened. Water mills powered by diverted streams processed harvests. Labor organization reflected emerging global trade networks, though their full consequences would unfold in later centuries. Across Anatolia's rural plains, nomadic Turkic tribes maintained seasonal migration patterns. Felt tents were dismantled and reassembled according to pasture availability. If you woke within such encampment, dogs guarding livestock might stir at distant movement. The horizon would appear vast and unobstructed. Constellations guided orientation as reliably as landmarks. In Venice, maritime republic of remarkable influence, canals functioned as primary arteries. If your awakening occurred within a palazzo along the Grand Canal, faint ripples against stone foundations would be audible even through thick walls. Lanterns placed upon gondolas created elongated reflections across dark water. Trade agreements negotiated within council chambers shaped commerce across Mediterranean and beyond. Dawn would later reveal bustling activity near the Rialto, yet in those quiet hours before sunrise, the city seemed suspended between opulence and vulnerability. In rural Anatolia or along the Danube frontier, peasants cultivated wheat fields that stretched toward distant hills. Crop rotation practices gradually improved soil fertility. If you woke within a timber farmhouse, the scent of stored grain would mingle with that of livestock housed nearby. The agricultural calendar dictated much of existence. Feast days interspersed with labor-created structure within yearly cycle. Night interruptions, whether by birth, illness, or weather, were woven naturally into this pattern. In Armenia's highlands, monasteries perched atop rugged outcrops. Illuminated manuscripts produced their combined vivid pigments with intricate script. If your awakening occurred within monastic cell, you might see a partially completed page resting upon desk, its margins adorned with detailed motifs. Ink derived from soot and plant extracts glistened faintly in low light. Artistic devotion intertwined with spiritual discipline. In regions bordering the Sahara's southern edge, trans-Saharan trade facilitated exchange of gold and salt. Caravans required months to complete journeys. If you woke in a caravanserai at desert's fringe, you would sense the exhaustion of travelers resting after long passage. Walls constructed from mud brick retained heat from previous day, releasing it gradually through night. Camels rested in enclosed courtyards, their breathing slow and rhythmic. Across these varied territories, darkness remained companion rather than adversary. It framed contemplation and underscored vulnerability. It reminded individuals of forces beyond immediate control: climate, political shifts, celestial cycles. As another evening would eventually descend, perhaps weeks or months after your initial awakening, you might find yourself again attentive to subtle changes in air and sound. Familiarity with night would not breed indifference; instead, it would cultivate awareness. The year 1400 unfolded without electric glow, without constant interruption. Waking at night meant entering a space shared by monks and merchants, farmers and scholars, sailors and shepherds. Each inhabited distinct environment, yet all stood beneath the same expansive sky. And within that shared canopy, the quiet interval between sleeps continued to offer its patient invitation, to observe, to consider, to breathe within the measured cadence of a world guided by sun, season, and enduring human resilience. There were also places where stone met desert in forms both ancient and newly inhabited. Along the Nile, settlements stretched like a ribbon beside fertile banks, the surrounding expanse opening into arid vastness. If you had awakened in 1400 within a dwelling near Cairo, the city's scale would feel immense even in darkness. Minarets pierced the skyline, their outlines faint against a sky scattered with stars. Courtyards enclosed by high walls preserved privacy and moderated heat. Mashrabiyah screens filtered moonlight into delicate lattice patterns across interior floors. During nocturnal wakefulness, you might sense the distant murmur of the Nile flowing steadily beyond clustered neighborhoods. Markets that bustled with activity by day lay temporarily subdued. Stalls covered with woven mats protected goods from dust. Donkeys tethered beside doorways shifted occasionally, hooves scraping lightly against stone. In the stillness, you might detect the fragrance of spices stored in sacks: coriander, cumin, saffron, each destined for kitchens across the region. Scholars in Cairo studied astronomy, mathematics, and law within institutions supported by Waqf endowments. Manuscripts copied there traveled far, linking intellectual communities from North Africa to Persia. If wakefulness drew you toward a shelf of texts, you might examine carefully inked diagrams illustrating planetary motion or geometric principles. Farther upstream, in Nubia, fortified settlements guarded trade routes along the river. Mud brick walls absorbed heat during day and released it gradually through night. If you awakened within such structure, desert air would feel dry and expansive. Constellations would appear luminous beyond expectation, unimpeded by humidity. In the Iberian Atlantic, the Canary Islands had begun to attract increasing attention from European powers. Indigenous Guanche communities inhabited volcanic terrain shaped by rugged cliffs and fertile valleys. If you had awakened in a cave dwelling carved into rock, moonlight might reveal terrace slopes descending toward darkened sea. Isolation shaped identity in such islands. Ocean winds carried salt and moisture, yet also reinforced separation from mainland politics. Across the Atlantic's western shores, the Mississippian culture's monumental earthworks still defined landscapes, though some centers had declined. If your night awakening occurred near one of these mounds in the Mississippi River Valley, the structure would loom as silent silhouette against horizon. Grass-covered slopes concealed layers of earlier construction. Communities organized around agriculture and riverine trade maintained networks across broad territories. Pottery decorated with intricate designs rested within dwellings constructed from timber and clay. Night sounds included the slow current of the river and the subtle movement of nocturnal animals along its banks. In the Iberian Peninsula's northern reaches, the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela Cathedral drew travelers from across Europe. If you had awakened within a pilgrim's hospice along this route, you would hear the soft breathing of strangers sharing communal space. Staffs and cloaks rested against walls, evidence of journeys undertaken for faith or penance. Before dawn, some pilgrims rose to continue their progress while air remained cool. Footsteps on gravel paths blended with rustle of leaves overhead. The cathedral itself, when reached, stood as culmination of weeks or months of travel. In the Low Countries, guild halls structured urban organization. If your awakening took place within a guild master's home in Ghent, you might reflect upon the intricate regulations governing craft production. Apprenticeships lasted years. Quality control protected reputation and economic stability. Guild symbols carved above doorways marked affiliation. By morning, workshops would reopen, each tool placed deliberately upon workbench. Across the Alps, in Swiss cantons, confederations formed to secure autonomy from powerful neighbors. Mountain passes connected communities otherwise separated by formidable terrain. If you awakened in a chalet perched along a slope, you would sense the steepness of landscape even without sight. Cowbells occasionally resonated faintly in distance as animals shifted in alpine meadows. Snow-capped peaks reflected starlight, their outlines sharp and austere. In the Balkans' coastal cities along the Adriatic, Venetian influence blended with local traditions. If you found yourself awake in Dubrovnik, massive stone walls encircling the city would create enclosure that felt both protective and confining. Narrow lanes paved with limestone glimmered faintly beneath moonlight. Merchants negotiated maritime contracts within loggias by day. At night, harbor waters lay calm, reflecting lantern light from anchored vessels. In the Maghreb, caravan routes connected inland oases with coastal ports. If your awakening occurred in an oasis settlement, date palms would form dark silhouettes against desert sky. Irrigation channels fed by underground sources nourished small gardens amidst aridity. Stars there appeared especially vivid. The Milky Way stretched overhead as luminous band, guiding travelers across seemingly endless sand. In southern India, the Vijayanagara Empire governed territories rich in agricultural productivity and temple architecture. Though its zenith would unfold more fully later in the century, foundations were already visible. Temples adorned with carved pillars stood along riverbanks. Elephants housed within royal enclosures occasionally shifted, chains clinking softly. Markets offered betel leaves, textiles, and carved stone idols once daylight arrived. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators traversed vast ocean distances guided by stars, currents, and bird flight patterns. If you had awakened aboard a double-hulled canoe anchored near a small island, night air would carry scent of salt and tropical vegetation. Navigation knowledge was memorized through chance and observation, transmitted across generations without written record. The sea's surface under starlight would appear textured and alive. In Central Europe, Bohemian lands experienced religious tension that would soon culminate in upheaval. If your night awakening occurred in Prague, the Charles Bridge spanning the Vltava River would appear as pale arc beneath moonlight. Towers guarding its ends rose in silent symmetry. Scholars at the university debated theological reform. Political currents flowed beneath daily routine. In quiet hours before dawn, these undercurrents might surface in contemplative thought. In the Iberian interior, shepherds practiced transhumance, guiding flocks between seasonal pastures. If you awoke in a temporary shelter constructed from branches and wool, you would sense proximity of animals resting nearby. The rhythm of their breathing would blend with distant wind. Such mobility required intimate knowledge of terrain and climate. Routes were memorized rather than mapped. Along the western coast of France, salt marshes produced crystals harvested carefully from shallow pans. If you had awakened in a salt worker's cottage, dawn would soon reveal reflective surfaces segmented into geometric patterns. Tools for scraping and collecting salt leaned against low walls. Salt served not only culinary purposes but preservation of food. Its value supported trade networks reaching far inland. In the Himalayan foothills, monasteries and villages adapted to steep valleys carved by glacial rivers. If your awakening occurred in a settlement near present-day Bhutan, prayer flags strung between poles would flutter gently even in darkness. Their fabric carried printed mantras meant to disperse blessings with each movement of air. Wooden houses with intricately painted facades stood against dramatic mountain backdrop. Dawn there arrived with swift clarity as sunlight spilled over ridgelines. Across North America's northeastern woodlands, Haudenosaunee communities organized longhouses accommodating extended families. If you awakened within such structure, embers in central hearth would cast faint glow upward through smoke holes in roof. Political organization among these nations emphasized council deliberation and collective decision-making. Wampum belts recorded agreements and history through patterned beads. In the Arabian Peninsula's interior, Bedouin tribes navigated desert expanses guided by wells known only to those familiar with land. If your night awakening occurred in a black goat hair tent, sand beneath woven rugs would feel cool. Camels resting nearby formed dark shapes against horizon. Poetry composed and recited within such communities preserved lineage and memory. Even in silence, that tradition lingered. In Castile's rural villages, Mudjar architecture reflected coexistence of Christian and Islamic artistic influences. Brick towers decorated with intricate patterns rose above modest houses. If you awakened there, moonlight would accentuate decorative geometry across surfaces. The blending of styles embodied centuries of interaction, conflict, and adaptation. In Flanders, painters experimented with oil techniques that allowed richer color and detail. Though much work unfolded during daylight, the preparation of panels and pigments sometimes extended into evening. If you awakened in an artisan's home, you might see wooden panels leaning against walls, primed with gesso awaiting brush. Morning would later reveal vivid hues layered carefully to create depth previously unattainable with tempera alone. Across Anatolia's eastern frontier, small principalities navigated between larger powers. If you awoke in a caravan crossing mountainous terrain, night sky framed by jagged peaks would appear narrow yet brilliant. Fires arranged in protective circle emitted sparks drifting upward. Guards maintained quiet vigilance, aware that bandits occasionally targeted caravans laden with silk and spices. In the Baltic forests, pagan traditions persisted alongside Christian practice. Sacred groves remained sites of reverence for some communities. If your awakening occurred near such grove, ancient trees would stand as dark columns beneath stars. Nature's presence carried spiritual resonance, shaping seasonal rituals and agricultural cycles. Throughout these varied lands, one unifying reality endured: the absence of pervasive artificial illumination. Night preserved depth and contrast rarely encountered in later centuries. When wakefulness arrived unexpectedly, it offered passage into this layered darkness, into the shared experience of a world governed by celestial motion and human adaptation. Another day would inevitably rise, drawing each of these landscapes back into activity. Yet within the interlude between sleeps, you would remain suspended, aware of your place among countless others who, in the year 1400, opened their eyes beneath the same ancient sky. Toward the darkest portion of the night, when even the restless dogs have grown quiet and the coals in the hearth have collapsed into a low crimson bed, the world seems to hover between presence and absence. In the year 1400, this interval carries a distinct texture. It is neither fully night nor even the first hint of dawn, but something suspended and inward. If you were awake now, you would sense that human activity has thinned to a faint thread, yet it has not entirely vanished. Inside a timbered house, the air feels cooler than it did hours before. The warmth that once radiated from the fire has retreated toward the stones. Linen sheets gather dampness from breath and from the quiet condensation that forms when warmth yields to the steady press of darkness. A sleeper turns, perhaps without waking fully, adjusting woolen blankets around shoulders and hips. Beneath the bed, rushes on the floor carry the faint scent of dried grasses and of the herbs scattered there months ago to discourage insects. If your eyes were open, they would struggle at first to discern shapes. The only light comes from embers and from the faint silver that filters through a narrow shutter. That silver originates from a moon, sometimes full and pale, sometimes a thin curve. Its angle depends on season and on latitude. In winter, the moon often rides higher and casts a sharper glow upon frost. In summer, it lingers lower, and its light feels softer, diluted by warmth that has not entirely faded. The sense of time at this hour is measured not by clocks but by bodily rhythms and by habit. Many households in 1400 do not experience night as a single unbroken span. There is often a first sleep and a second sleep, divided by a waking interval that may last an hour or more. During that interval, some remain still, letting thoughts drift. Others rise quietly to stir the embers, to drink water from a wooden cup, or to murmur private prayers before returning to bed. This waking is not considered unusual. It is part of the architecture of rest. Outside the house, the village lane lies empty, its packed earth faintly luminous under the moon. Roofs of thatch absorb the light and release it in a dull sheen. The outlines of barns and sheds form patient silhouettes. A tethered animal shifts its weight, the rope creaking softly against a post. Somewhere beyond the immediate cluster of dwellings, an owl glides over a hedgerow, wings silent, attentive to the smallest stir in grass. If you were to step beyond the threshold, wrapping a cloak around your shoulders, the cold would reach your skin quickly. In winter, frost might lace the ground, stiffening blades of grass into brittle filaments. In autumn, dampness would rise from fields newly harvested, carrying the scent of turned soil and chaff. In spring, the air would hold a sweetness, a promise of green not yet visible in darkness. In summer, even at this late hour, a residue of heat might linger, and distant insects would hum in low, continuous vibration. The night sky in 1400 is a vault of astonishing clarity. Without artificial illumination, stars multiply until the darkness seems woven with light. Constellations are not abstract patterns but familiar presences, learned through repetition and through inherited lore. Farmers read them to judge seasons. Mariners, far from inland villages, rely upon them to hold a steady course. Clerics contemplate them as evidence of divine order. The arc of the Milky Way stretches across the firmament like a faint river of powdered stone. You might tilt your head upward and feel, not insignificance, but a quiet inclusion within a vast design. The air is free of smoke at this hour, and breath rises in a visible plume during colder months. Your own heartbeat seems louder than usual, magnified by the stillness. The earth beneath your feet feels stable, enduring, as it has for generations before you and will for generations yet to come. Within the house once more, the waking interval can invite reflection. In 1400, knowledge of the wider world arrives slowly, carried by travelers, merchants, and clergy. Tales of distant cities circulate in fragments. Names such as Venice, Paris, or Cairo might be known in outline, associated with trade, with pilgrimage, or with scholarship. For most villagers, however, the horizon remains close. Fields, forests, and the nearest market town define the edges of daily existence. During this quiet stretch of wakefulness, thoughts might drift toward obligations waiting with dawn. There are animals to tend, tools to mend, bread to bake, cloth to spin. Each task belongs to a cycle larger than any single day. Agricultural life follows a calendar shaped by saints' days and by natural signs. In February, pruning begins. In April, plowing deepens. In August, grain bends heavy under sun. In October, apples are pressed, and wood is stacked for the coming cold. The church tower, rising above the village, stands as a steady axis even in darkness. Though its bells are silent now, they will soon announce the canonical hours. Monastic communities nearby rise long before dawn for matins and lauds, their chants carried through stone corridors lit by candles. Within cloisters, figures wrapped in wool move through routines honed over centuries. Manuscripts rest on lecterns, their margins filled with careful script. Wax drips onto parchment edges. Ink dries in steady strokes. If your village lies near a river, that river continues its slow passage regardless of human sleep. Water slips around stones, murmuring softly. In colder months, thin ice forms along the banks, cracking when disturbed by the current beneath. Bridges, often built of timber and reinforced with stone, cast elongated shadows. A watchman in a larger town might pace such a bridge, lantern shielded to preserve fuel, alert to any sign of fire or theft. Fire remains a constant concern in 1400. Houses built of wood and thatch are vulnerable. During the waking interval of night, some householders check the hearth to ensure no stray spark has leapt beyond its boundary. The memory of past blazes lingers in collective memory, entire streets once reduced to charcoal and ash. Buckets stand ready near wells. In towns, ordinances regulate how and where flames may be kept. Beyond villages and towns, castles punctuate the landscape, their walls pale under moonlight. Within those fortifications, guards maintain watch along battlements. Armor glints faintly. Torches gutter in iron brackets. The wind moves more strongly at such heights, carrying scents from distant fields and forests. In the keep, thick walls hold the cold at bay more effectively than timbered cottages, yet even there, night seeps inward. If you were a traveler lodged at an inn along a trade route, your waking would occur amid unfamiliar sounds. Other guests breathe heavily in shared chambers. A horse stamps in the stable below. The innkeeper, having banked the main hearth, sleeps lightly, attentive to disturbance. Roads in 1400 are uneven and often treacherous. Merchants carry goods such as wool, salt, wine, or spices across long distances, their journeys measured in weeks. At night, they rest with their wares close at hand. The broader political landscape of the year 1400 remains unsettled in many regions. Kingdoms negotiate alliances, borders shift, and conflicts flare intermittently. Yet for most individuals awake in the deepest hour, these distant struggles feel abstract. The immediate world consists of family, field, parish, and market. News of wars travels slowly and often arrives softened by retelling. Still, change is underway in subtle ways. In certain cities, craftsmen experiment with techniques that will later transform communication and art. Metalworkers refine tools. Shipbuilders alter hull shapes to navigate open seas more effectively. Scholars copy ancient texts preserved through earlier centuries, preserving knowledge that might otherwise fade. These developments are rarely visible to a villager standing under stars, yet they are present, like seeds buried beneath soil. Returning to bed during this interval requires little ceremony. A final adjustment of blankets, a brief closing of shutters against chill, and the body settles again. The second sleep tends to be deeper, dream-laden. In 1400, dreams carry meaning for many. They are interpreted through religious frameworks, through folk traditions, or through personal intuition. A vivid dream might prompt a pilgrimage, a vow, or a quiet change in conduct. As night edges toward morning, a subtle shift occurs. It is not immediately visible but sensed in temperature and in the quality of silence. The darkness begins to thin imperceptibly. The eastern horizon acquires a diluted tone, neither black nor yet blue. Roosters, sensitive to this change, stir before light fully appears. One calls tentatively, then another answers. The sound threads through the village, a fragile announcement. Within the house, sleepers begin to move more frequently. The body recognizes approaching dawn even without conscious awareness. Limbs stretch. Hands reach instinctively for familiar objects. The embers in the hearth, if coaxed gently, can be persuaded back into flame. A small twist of straw ignites, and a new day begins with the soft crackle of kindling. If you were to rise now, the air would feel sharper than it did hours before. Breath would cloud briefly before dissolving. Outside, the first true light reveals forms that were mere silhouettes moments earlier. Fields emerge in muted colors. Trees regain their individuality. The church tower stands defined against a paling sky. The transition from night to morning in 1400 unfolds gradually. There is no sudden blaze, no abrupt change. Instead, light seeps across the landscape, touching rooftops, then hedgerows, then the damp earth of paths. Birds commence a layered chorus, each species entering at its accustomed moment. Their song is not hurried. It unfolds in patient sequence. You might step outside once more, feeling the ground beneath your bare feet or through simple shoes of leather. The village begins to breathe again. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin columns. Doors creak open. Water is drawn from wells. The first movements of livestock signal the return of routine. The waking at night, with its private reflections and its immersion in darkness, recedes into memory. Yet something of it remains. The experience of rising in the depth of night leaves a subtle imprint. It heightens awareness of the world's vastness and of one's small but steady place within it. It reveals how much continues beyond the reach of sight, rivers flowing, stars wheeling, distant cities turning through their own cycles of rest and labor. In the year 1400, to wake at night is to encounter a world stripped of distraction. Without artificial glare, without the constant noise of machinery, the senses adjust to subtler registers. The creak of timber, the sigh of wind along a wall, the faint rustle of straw beneath bedding, all assume significance. Time feels elastic, unmeasured by ticking mechanisms but guided by bodily rhythm and by celestial motion. As daylight strengthens, these impressions do not vanish entirely. They settle quietly beneath the surface of activity. The tasks of the day, baking bread, tending animals, shaping wood, spinning wool, resume their familiar cadence. Markets fill later with color and with barter. Bells ring at appointed hours. Yet beneath all of it lies the memory of the deep night, when the world seemed immense and hushed. The year itself will continue its progression. Seasons will turn. Harvests will succeed or falter. Children will grow. Elders will pass from life. Buildings will weather and be repaired. Across oceans and continents, events will unfold beyond immediate awareness. Still, in this small village, in this single house, the pattern of waking and sleeping will repeat, night after night. And if, on some future evening, you find yourself stirring again in the darkness of 1400, you will recognize the texture of that hour. You will know the gentle chill against your skin, the faint gleam of embers, the silent procession of stars overhead. You will understand that night is not an emptiness but a presence, layered and intricate. In that recognition, there is a quiet companionship with countless others across fields and forests, along coasts and within cities, who also open their eyes briefly before dawn. Though separated by distance and by circumstance, they share the same sky and the same gradual return of light. Thus the night concludes not with spectacle but with renewal. Morning unfolds, steady and unhurried, and the cycle continues. Toward the hour before dawn, when the night has thinned but has not yet surrendered, the world of 1400 holds its breath in a different way. The darkness is no longer complete. It has depth instead of weight. The sky seems stretched and fragile, as though light is quietly pressing against it from beyond the horizon. If you wake again at this hour, you sense a shift that is more felt than seen. The embers in the hearth are now faint and powdered with ash. The air carries a sharper chill than it did earlier. Night's warmth has faded, and the stones of the house release their stored cold. The straw mattress feels less forgiving. Beneath the quiet, something anticipatory moves through the world, subtle but undeniable. Outside, frost may be forming in a thin silver veil over thatch and timber, depending on the season. In warmer months, dew gathers along fence posts and clings to the tips of tall grasses. Each droplet trembles with the smallest motion of air. The moon, if it still hangs above, appears drained of brightness. Its authority diminishes as the eastern sky begins to pale. Stars retreat one by one, their sharpness dissolving into a wash of indigo. This is the hour of preparation. Within monasteries, movement begins before light arrives. Figures rise from narrow pallets, wrapping coarse habits around their shoulders. Sandals whisper across worn stone floors. A bell may sound, measured, deliberate, calling the community to the final prayer of the night. The sound does not shatter the quiet, it gathers it. In towns, bakers stir. Ovens must be heated long before sunrise if bread is to be ready by morning. Wood is stacked within the domed interior, sparks coaxed into flame. The scent of burning oak or beech drifts through narrow streets. Flour dust will soon hang in the air, pale against the growing light. In port cities, sailors wake as well. Ships anchored in harbor creak gently with the tide. Ropes groan against wooden posts. The tide charts are not written on paper alone but carried in memory and observation. Departure must align with water's rhythm. Men climb aboard, checking lines, adjusting sails even in dimness. Beyond the walls of any settlement, farmers begin their day before the sun appears. Cows low softly in enclosed yards, awaiting milking. Sheep shift in their pens. The breath of animals steams in the cold. The rhythm of life in 1400 does not wait for full daylight. It moves with necessity rather than comfort. If you step outside at this hour, the air greets you with clarity. Sounds travel farther in pre-dawn stillness. A distant cart rolling over frozen earth may seem closer than it truly is. The bark of a dog echoes cleanly. The first rooster calls, not as a proclamation of triumph, but as a simple acknowledgement of change. Fields appear ghost-like under the paling sky. Furrows lie in quiet rows. Bare trees stand as inked silhouettes against a deepening blue. In southern lands, olive groves shimmer faintly. In northern regions, hedgerows form dark seams across open ground. Within castles, guards rotate their watch. The men who stood upon battlements through the deepest hours descend narrow staircases, faces drawn with fatigue. Fresh watchmen take their places, scanning fields that now reveal more shape than shadow. Armor is colder at this time, metal stiff against skin. Markets are not yet alive, but their frameworks wait. Wooden stalls, folded and secured overnight, will soon open like skeletal blossoms. Merchants will arrange wares, spices in cloth sacks, bolts of dyed wool, rough pottery, iron tools. Each object has traveled its own long road to arrive here. In larger cities, such as Paris, Florence, or London, the change from night to morning unfolds gradually but with density. Chimneys begin to smoke in greater number. Doors open to release wastewater into gutters. Apprentices hurry along streets carrying bundles or messages. Bakers pull the first loaves from ovens, crusts crackling as heat escapes. Even the light itself in 1400 feels different from modern light. It is not filtered through glass panes in most dwellings. It enters directly, through shutters thrown open, across thresholds unshielded. It reveals imperfections without apology, the uneven plaster of walls, the worn grain of wooden tables, the smoke-darkened rafters. If you have remained awake through the night, you may feel both weary and sharpened. The world around you has transformed slowly, without spectacle. Night has not vanished, it has dissolved. As the first true line of gold appears at the horizon, birds begin to stir in greater number. Sparrows flit from eaves. Ravens croak from rooftops. In marshlands, cranes lift from reeds with heavy grace. Light spreads like diluted milk across the landscape. Colors emerge gradually. Brown earth becomes distinct from green shoots. Stone walls reveal texture. The sky shifts from indigo to pale blue, streaked with rose. morning labor intensifies. Women draw water from wells, balancing wooden buckets with practiced steadiness. Laundry may be begun early, before heavier tasks claim the day. Fires are rebuilt within hearths. Porridge simmers in iron pots. In workshops, craftsmen prepare tools. A blacksmith clears yesterday's ash from his forge, pumping bellows until coals flare bright. The metallic scent of heated iron joins the smells of bread and damp earth. A weaver adjusts the tension of threads stretched taut upon a loom. A cobbler arranges leather pieces cut the day before. Monastic scriptoria gradually fill with soft light, illuminating parchment pages. Ink glistens briefly before drying. Each letter is formed with intention, the act of writing both labor and devotion. Elsewhere, in fortified towns near contested borders, soldiers ready themselves for patrol. Armor is fastened with methodical care. Horses are saddled, their flanks brushed to remove frost. The world beyond walls is uncertain, and daylight brings exposure as well as clarity. Trade routes awaken. Caravans that rested through the night resume their journeys. In regions connected by the Silk Road, camels rise from kneeling positions, loads secured once more. Merchants glance at the sky to judge weather. In Mediterranean ports, small fishing boats push off from shore, nets coiled at their feet. The church bells begin to mark the hour more publicly now. Their tones ripple across valleys and through streets, layering over one another in towns with multiple parishes. The sound shapes the day, dividing it into segments recognizable even to those who cannot read a clock. As sunlight strengthens, shadows shorten and sharpen. Frost melts into droplets that fall quietly from branches. Dew evaporates. Paths that seemed pale under early light darken as moisture lifts. Children wake fully now, their presence altering the tone of the morning. Their footsteps scatter across courtyards. They carry water, gather kindling, tend younger siblings. Education, where available, begins in cathedral schools or within noble households. In rural manors, stewards review tasks for the day, fields to be plowed, hedges repaired, livestock counted. Though you hear no spoken directives here, movement itself reveals intention. Workers disperse across land in purposeful lines. If you walk toward the edge of a forest at this hour, you encounter another transformation. Night creatures retreat. Owls withdraw to hollow trunks. Foxes slip into dens. In their place, deer emerge cautiously, stepping through low undergrowth. Sunlight filters between branches in angled shafts, illuminating suspended dust. Rivers brighten as well. Their surfaces, once black and opaque, now reflect sky and bank. Water wheels turn steadily beside mills, powered by currents indifferent to human sleep. The grinding of grain begins anew, a low mechanical murmur that will continue for hours. Throughout Europe, and across other continents, the year 1400 holds varied climates and cultures, yet this transition from night to morning remains universal. Whether in the cool air of Scandinavia, the sun-warmed hills of Tuscany, the plains of Anatolia, or the valleys of the Maghreb, dawn carries a similar quiet insistence. The memory of night lingers only briefly. Tasks multiply. Attention shifts outward. If you consider your own wakefulness, it becomes clear that night offered something daylight does not. Night allowed inward reflection and intimacy with sound and shadow. Morning demands engagement. It pulls you into motion. By mid-morning, the sky is fully blue. Clouds drift in slow procession. Roads grow busier. Travelers pass one another with nods. Wagons creak under sacks of grain or barrels of wine. Monks walk in pairs along dusty paths, sandals tapping rhythmically. The structure of the day in 1400 depends heavily on light. Without artificial illumination beyond candles and oil lamps, productivity aligns with the sun's arc. Morning is precious. In fields, plows cut furrows guided by oxen. The earth yields reluctantly, yet consistently. Seed will be scattered in due season. Harvest will come months later. Life is arranged around cycles longer than any single dawn. In fields, plows cut furrows guided by oxen. The earth yields reluctantly, yet consistently. Seed will be scattered in due season. Harvest will come months later. Life is arranged around cycles longer than any single dawn. In cities, guilds regulate labor. Apprentices sweep floors, fetch materials, observe masters at work. Skills pass from hand to hand, from generation to generation. A young artisan learns not only technique but patience. The cathedral bells ring again. Their sound is no longer mysterious, it is practical. Time is marked not by glowing screens but by resonance across air. As the sun climbs higher, warmth replaces chill. Cloaks are loosened. Frost is forgotten. The memory of night becomes distant, as though it belonged to another existence entirely. And yet, beneath the visible busyness of morning, traces of the night remain within you. The memory of darkness, of subtle sounds and long shadows, lingers quietly. It informs how you see the day. It reminds you that every brightness has an edge, and every stillness holds movement waiting to unfold. In 1400, waking at night reveals a world structured not only by hardship and labor, but by rhythm, an interplay of shadow and illumination, rest and exertion, silence and sound. Now, as the day settles into its full stride, you understand that night will return again. It always does. And when it does, the same slow transformation will begin anew, guiding the world gently from light back into darkness, and from darkness once more toward dawn.